Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Found Media Podcast. My name is Carolyn. I will be your host, and I will be the one collecting stories from around the internet that are scary or unexplained. All original authors will be credited in the description, where you can also find an email in case you have a story of your own that you would like us to read. For our first episode, we have a collection of stories from Reddit that take place in the woods. In 2016, my boyfriend, now husband, and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was primitive. Camping was free, there was no cell service, barely a road, etc. We did encounter two other people. They might not factor into what happened later, but they were creepy, so I'll describe them. The first was a woman who had her truck off to the road a little as we drove past. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop to offer help. Usually, my boyfriend had no problem helping someone, but he said this time something about her put him off. She didn't really seem like she needed help, and usually people who need help look at you hopefully as you approach. She looked like she was just expecting we would stop. That's what my boyfriend said anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything strange about her. The next person came when we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out each time was the same car, and the man in the car watched us each time he passed. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we had driven around for a while before finding a place we liked. It had been raining and everything was muddy, and we wanted the driest site possible. He could have been doing the same thing. We briefly thought about moving, but the road was muddy too. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was follow the tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us. He didn't come by another time, so we stayed and spent several hours before dark goofing off. No one else drove by. Whether or not those two had anything to do with our experience, the real fear came later. We had gone to sleep in our tent, and sometime around 3 a.m., we were woken by a loud noise. I couldn't describe it very well, or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It was also similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker, is another way he described it. He jumped up and looked out the little window, but couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself another few times. I was too scared to speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it was probably miles off and I should just go back to sleep. I didn't question this, as I had figured loud sounds could easily be heard, miles off. After we left, he told me it sounded like it had actually been coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper if apparently the sound was far off. I was still terrified. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We laid there for a while longer, when finally my boyfriend told me to get dressed because we were leaving. I was alarmed by this, and even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we bought just for this trip from its plastic before opening the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I couldn't really see. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed before we got into the car. There was a beer can by our dead fire that hadn't been there before. We didn't even bring beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained he was nervous someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run from the tent right away. He also half expected to find our gas tank had been siphoned out, but that wouldn't have stopped us because we have a hybrid car. The rest of the trip, we stayed in well-populated campsites or got a hotel. One of my best buds from college was a geologist major that ended up becoming a ranger in the southeast US. We haven't spoken in years, as is the case with age, but I remember about 8 to 9 years back, he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them come to the park several days in a row and found out they were visiting from the West, and they had gotten engaged there decades prior. They had been searching for a spot they'd taken pictures of when he popped the question, but were having trouble. After looking at the pictures and figuring out where they were trying to get to, he escorted them to his vehicle, then hiked with them to where he thought it could be. They found it, and he left them there and went back to his station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling once he got back, and felt like he needed to wait and see them whenever they left. Well, once it came time to lock up for the night, he still hadn't seen them leave, so he reported it, left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance, and went back to where he left them. He found them both lying down, spooning along the bank of the river. Neither were alive. He called the cops, went through the 9 yards, and went home. The police were able to disclose to him their identities, but weren't sure anything else initially. Later, he learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer, and they had both committed suicide by ingesting some sort of chemical or pill combination medley. They just chose to do it where they had gotten engaged. My buddy wasn't torn up about it. He was obviously sad for them dying, but said that he thought they hadn't asked for help earlier because they didn't want anyone to think they helped kill them. I used to be in a group that's somewhat like the Scouts, so we spent a lot of time in the woods, and some weird stuff happened often, but most of the time it was easy to explain. One thing happened, though, that to this day scares the crap out of me. I was a leader for the age group 8 to 10 years old, and we were out on a camping trip. It was the first time we stayed on that terrain, and it was huge. Normally, we tend to explore the majority of the terrain before the kids arrive, so we're aware of any possible dangerous spots to avoid. This time, it was impossible. Every camp, we have what we call a night game. It's usually a scary game in which the kids have to complete several tasks while the leaders scare the ever-loving crap out of them. Obviously, we had one too during that camp. We masked up as monsters and hid out in the woods, close to the checkpoints they had to pass. While running between the checkpoints, I found an open stretch of forest with little to no foliage, so it was ideal for chasing after them. There was no real room to hide besides the trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or they'd be able to see me from miles away. It was dark, like that unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes, and you start imagining things that aren't real. During my stay, I saw a shadow that was around my size running past me a few times. I couldn't see it very well, so I just assumed I was imagining things because there was nothing there when I turned my flashlight on. The game was nearing its end, and I saw the shadow again. This time, I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it was one of the leaders hiding to scare kids and decided to go over there as it was about time to go back. I aimed my flashlight towards the trees, and while getting closer, I noticed that there was indeed someone standing there, dressed in what looked like a torn burlap sack, and had their head covered with a few plastic bags that looked like they were tied together. I started to feel pure dread. Something felt really off. I asked if everything was okay, but they didn't respond. The only thing I heard was this weird sound that sounded like someone knocking on wood. Nevertheless, I went a bit closer until I was about 10 meters away from this person. The knocking sound turned out to be that person smacking his head repeatedly into the tree, and I noticed he looked like a male. He was barefoot, and his arms and legs were covered with crusted mud. His hands were in a weird, cramped position. I was convinced this was just one of the other leaders pulling a prank, so I told them to knock it off. He slowly turned his head and started walking towards me. Something inside me told me to run. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank and I ran away scared for nothing. If this wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger, so I ran as fast as I could. I could hear him running after me, but I didn't want to turn around to look, as I'd probably run into a tree. I arrived back at the campsite, and every single person that could be dressed like that was already there. They couldn't have gotten there before me, and if they did, they sure as hell didn't have time to change into their regular clothes. Still, I told them what happened and that they had given me a good scare with that. They just looked at me weird, thinking I was trying to scare them, and we left it at that. The next day, I went to go check it out. Who knows, maybe some weirdo ate mushrooms and might be out there dying from hypothermia. I took someone else with me just in case, and there was nothing but endless trees. We arrived at the tree where I saw the person banging his head, and there was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. We called the cops. They looked around and quickly brushed it off as just a prank from another scouting group or some kids from the nearby town, and left it at that. We didn't notice anything weird after that, so it was probably just a dumb prank. But seriously, some people have a messed up sense of humor. I have been a ranger with the USFS for almost 15 years, but this takes place about 3 years after I joined. We were getting calls about a lone wolf with a collar on, hanging around campsites. Weird, since wolves aren't known to be in the area, but when you work in the field long enough, you start to realize anything is possible. No calls had mentioned violent behavior from the animal, thank God. I wandered around for about 3 hours before I took a break for some water. I sat down, had a snack, drank some water, and was getting ready to go again when the thing was about 20 feet out, trotting near the tree line. It seemed friendly and had the collar, so I whistled to it and he came over to me. Getting a closer look, I could see it wasn't a wolf. It was huge, but it was dark, and didn't have the right body structure, though I could see why it'd be confused from a distance. I radioed in and reported that I had the dog with me, but as soon as I said I'd bring it in, the dog took off. It's like he was playing to see how far he could get me to chase him. I went after it, and I swear it was the game of chase for like 5 minutes as we steadily ran through the forest. The dog finally slowed down near a rock bed or creek area and started pacing around a spot. I drew closer and didn't see anything off at first, but then I noticed it. The overgrowth had almost disguised what appeared to be bones. I called it in immediately, and another team was sent over to recover the remains. When I went to retrieve the dog, he was just gone. But honestly, it wasn't a priority at that point. He was friendly enough, and I'd figured we'd catch up to him later. The bones were identified as a teenage male's, died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He'd been reported missing in the area long before I became a ranger, and there'd been pretty much no hope in finding him. I spoke to his mom on the phone. She called to thank me personally, and she asked how I'd found her son. I mentioned the black dog, and then I thought I'd said something wrong since there was a pause on her side of the line. I gave a couple details about the dog, and she quietly explained that her son, who struggled with making connections, had sunken into a deeper depression after the death of his best friend, that very dog that had led me to him. I think I spent the rest of the day stunned. I continued to be in disbelief in a way, but I know what happened. The university that I went to was in a large city that had small hills and large mountains in the distance, some near, some far, that wove in and around the city. One morning, I parked in the lot in the first aisle of the second parking lot, as I always did. As I got out of my vehicle, I was overwhelmed by a compulsion to physically go to a specific point in one of the hills that you could see from campus. At one time or another, I had explored every one of those hills and mountains before that time, and the point that I felt compelled to look at was nothing special. The area was low rolling hills, quite visible for miles, with no boulders or trees nearby. With nothing of note to look at, it was quite a boring area. It was only hours after I had been on campus that I heard that a student went missing the day before. The student was from a completely different major and someone whom I had never heard of. We had absolutely no connection other than we went to the same large university at the same time. I have no idea why, but the second I heard about the disappearance, I connected it to the compulsion that I had felt to go look at the point in the hills. The person remained missing, and the news about the disappearance had waned long before. Yet every day as I got out of my vehicle, and when I got back to it each afternoon, I was compelled to go look at it at the same point in the hill. I was far too busy with school to heed the compulsion to go. Quite frankly, I was also too scared to tell anyone because stories had come out in the news that police had framed innocent people who had come forward with information about other crimes. Every day as I was parking in the morning and every night as I went back to my vehicle, I was called to this point by something, even though I couldn't see the outline of the hills in the dark. I desperately tried to distract myself for a few days, but it didn't work, and I finally just gave in to looking at that one spot in the hill twice a day and silently apologizing over and over. I wished that someone else would go to that spot and look around, because I knew that spot had something to do with the disappearance. I don't remember how long it took, but it was a long time. But they finally found the remains of the body at the exact spot that I had been compelled to look at every single day and night the entire time. The police had withheld certain details, some of which came out when the body was found. The detail that struck me was that the night that the student disappeared, their vehicle had been found in the second lot, first aisle, the same one that I always parked in. I still have to apologize whenever I think of that experience. Back in the early 90s, my brother and I were staying with my cousin and her husband, who I'll call Scott, who was a DNR officer. This was opening day of deer season in northern Michigan. While I was at least a mile from any road or trail, I stumbled across an area that looked like people had been camping recently. They'd even built this weird outdoor kitchen. Being a naive 16 to 7-year-old, the kitchen confused me, but I figured they had left because hunting season had started, so I just continued on my way. That night, I was telling everyone about it when Scott gets serious and asks me what it looked like and where it was. After I told him, he warned me not to go back there and to be glad no one was there. Apparently, some locals had multiple locations like that where they would go and cook meth so they wouldn't blow up their houses and make it harder to get caught. I guess Scott reported it to the cops and they raided it a couple days later. I must have missed it, but the guys had set up multiple trail cams all around the area. Based on the pictures of them, I missed the guys by a few hours. They were heavily armed, while I only had a bow and a knife. On the surface, it seems a well-thought-out plan for some smart people, but they weren't very smart after all. Scott filled us in later on some details. Apparently, they didn't clear the images off the cameras before leaving. The images, though too low of a resolution to recognize their faces, show them not only cooking meth, but also carrying illegal guns and riding off on customized four-wheelers known to everyone in the area. They ended up getting 20 years in prison. I have a buddy who works long hours, but he got a pit bull mix who needs a lot of exercise. My friend takes the dog on hikes in the woods at least a couple times per week, and he often only has time to go out at night. All my other friends think he's nuts for enjoying these night hikes, but he takes a flashlight and a headlamp, and he's this type of outdoorsman who usually has a handgun tucked into his waistband. We were pretty close friends, though, and he'd often invite me on these hikes. Sometimes it was actually pretty nice to go tramp out in the woods if the weather was decent. This one night was weird, though. This was during late winter, early spring. The weather had been warming up for the past week or so, to the point where there were actually some plants beginning to bloom. But then we experienced a sudden ice storm, and everything was quickly frozen over. A day or two later, the temperature was back up in the low 50s, and this was when I was invited out for the night hike. Everything was wet from the ice melting, and it had gotten a lot darker outside than usual due to the cloudy sky. We parked the car and made our way up the familiar trail that meanders along this creek through a small valley. I remember that it was unusually quiet in the woods that night. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, etc. It was unusual, but it didn't faze us. It was pretty nice. After making it about 2 miles up the trail, the dog kind of just takes off around a bend, maybe 15 yards in front of us. We round the corner, and he is just standing there, frozen, looking off to the right of the trail, into a mess of brush and small trees. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up, and he was bent down, low, but he didn't bark or make any aggressive moves. We caught up to him and kind of asked each other what was going on, and then stood there in silence for a few seconds. Then suddenly, the whole forest broke out with animal activity. I think the first noise was an owl hoot, but it sounded like multiple owls at once, maybe 3 or 4. And then the trees just seemed to wake up, and you could hear all the birds flapping and hooting and flying and squawking around in the wetness. It felt like there was about 10 seconds of this chaotic noise, and then it all went back to complete silence. Obviously, we were both a little bit freaked out. All my hairs were standing on end, and we briefly debated turning around, but just decided that things were probably weird because of the rapidly changing weather. We decided to keep going, but the dog is still frozen, staring into the brush. We took maybe 5 steps towards the dog, and then it happened. From the brush comes this wail that I will never be able to properly describe. It started like a whine and progressed to this rumbling, screeching noise, like nothing I've ever heard. We both froze and stood there staring, just like the dog. And then about 5 seconds later, we heard it again, just as loud, but not quite as long as the first. I don't even know if we exchanged any words, but within about 10 seconds, the 3 of us were headed quickly back down the trail in the direction we came from. To this day, I have no idea what we heard. I listened to sound bites of coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, etc., and nothing sounds like that noise. I know it was an animal that probably felt threatened, but my buddy is also the kind of guy that likes to think this is some sort of Squatch encounter. I don't believe that at all, but it was definitely the most bizarre experience that I've ever had out in the woods, and I'd prefer that it never happened to me again. I got this story from my cousin Steve that I'd like to share. Keep in mind that I might be missing a few details and Steve could just be pulling my leg, but he seemed awfully serious when he told me. Steve is an outdoorsy person. He likes to camp and hike and stuff. He never gave me specifics on where he was in the story, so could be anywhere in a forested area in the wilderness. He said it was late September, early October, something like that, and this was in 2004, I think. Steve said he set up a little campsite in a small clearing, no bigger than a large living room. The first night, everything went fine, no troubles at all. But that afternoon, quite a while after he'd woken back up, he felt oddly drawn to somewhere off in the distance in the forest. He said he was like on autopilot and wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. Steve said he wasn't too far away from the campsite into the trees when he noticed what looked like a toppled over grave. That's how he described it, at least, a rectangular slab of stone. But what he said, it was weirdly out of place, and it definitely didn't belong there. He said it looked polished, sort of glossy and reflective. There was no writing or scrawling on it, it was just smooth and plain. But despite it sitting on a pile of dead leaves, there was no forest debris on it. No twigs, fallen leaves, or even moss on it at all. This was very unusual, especially considering, to his knowledge, there was nobody around for miles, but it looked like it had just been placed there very recently. At this moment, Steve said he felt as though he had been picked up and dropped randomly somewhere on Earth, and had zero clue where he was. He even said, though he could clearly make out the red canvas or nylon or whatever his tent was made out of, 20 or so feet behind him, he was utterly confused and totally unfamiliar with his surroundings. Then he said that two things happened very quickly. First, he felt an ice-cold wave of air hitting him. Like a cold wind on a frigid winter day, despite it being relatively warm for early autumn, and there was no wind present. The branches on the trees hadn't moved, and the leaves on the ground didn't budge at all. Secondly, he heard what sounded like a loud, deafening clap, like someone clapped their hands just once, really hard, and it echoed across the valley. Next thing he knew, the sun is already dipping below the horizon, and it's pretty dark in the woods. Only a split second earlier, it had been about 3:30 in the afternoon. Now it was closer to 8 at night, in the blink of an eye. Steve said he did not see the stone on the ground anywhere, and he had booked it back to his tent, scared out of his mind. According to him, it wasn't a good idea to pack up everything right at dusk and try to make his way back to civilization during the night, so he'd have to wait until morning to do so. Now, I'd love to say this story was some creepy alien story, like he saw UFOs flying overhead, or there was a skinwalker or wendigo or something, because those are creepy. But that was about it, except for one other thing. He said he barely slept that entire night. All the while, he heard a seriously creepy sound not far from the tent. Steve said it sounded like someone snoring, and it might have simply been just a sleeping animal like a bear or a mountain lion. I'm not too sure if they snore, but I'm guessing they do. Anyway, he said he'd waited a little bit after dawn until it was finally light out. He packed up his stuff and got out of there, with the feeling he was being watched the entire time he left the woods. Last year, I spent 2 months in the winds of Wyoming with a leadership training group. On the morning of our second day, my bowel movements were telling me it was time to go. I am a devout follower of the leave no trace principle, and you should be too, which has certain stipulations regarding one doing their business. As part of this, you need to be a minimum of 100 feet away from all water sources, trails, and campsites. I gather my trowel and bear spray and set out to do number 2. I went what I figured to be 100 feet and realized that my campsite and group mates were still in plain view through the leafless foliage, so I decided to continue on to find some privacy. After some 100 yards or so, I was well hidden from the camp and began thrusting my trowel into the ground to dig my foxhole. After 2 quick strikes, it became clear that just under the bed of forest was a layer of rock, so I decided to keep searching for another spot. I didn't want to go any further from camp, so I headed back in the direction I thought camp was. At some point, I must have gotten turned around, and I realized this after a few minutes of walking and not recognizing any of the landmarks which I had noticed on my way out from camp. This was fine, as I had found myself without my bearings plenty of times before, and was always able to make it back to a trail or camp or whatever. I gave a shout signal, which my group had established before we set out, to use as a way to locate one another. My shout was returned by the deafening silence of the forest. At this point, I should have sat down to collect myself before making any sort of rash decision. That was a huge mistake. I decided that I would go back in the direction I had just come from and would be able to gather my bearings from there. I did so and soon accepted that I was truly lost. I had no idea how far I was from the group. I had absolutely no sense of direction and began to freak. Without thinking, I started in a panic-induced jog in whatever direction I was facing. I was hyperventilating and could feel the tear ducts start to activate. This went on for nearly 7 hours, with intermittent breaks, as I sat down in a marshy kind of area with reeds and heard the familiar silence from the forest. Only the silence was soon interrupted by what I made out to be footsteps and the rustling of the brush. I stood up to see the upper half of a trail runner who had decided to run off-trail. I called, but he couldn't hear me, so I quickly took off in a dead sprint towards him, finally getting his attention. He stopped, and I approached him, quickly explaining my situation. I told him the campsite my group was at when I left, and he just kind of stared at me. "Are you sure that's where you were?" he said to me. I was sure. He didn't believe me because I had ended up almost 10 miles away from anyone, completely alone in the vastest expanses of the wilderness in the continental US. He guided me back to the trail and sent me on my way. I made it back to camp, much to the relief of my 2 instructors, who quickly satellite phoned their superiors to let them know I had been located. A full-scale SAR operation was about a half hour from commencing when I had returned. That was the scariest day of my life, and I care not imagine what would have become of me had that trail runner not been running through that particular marshland out of the hundreds of square miles and thousands of routes he could have taken. If you're out there, kind stranger, thank you. So I think that is going to do it for our first episode. Be sure to like the video if you're on YouTube. If you're on the podcast app, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future podcasts with creepy stories or true crime cases that we're going to talk about. Again, any case suggestions that you would like to hear or stories of your own can be sent to the email found in the description. I hope to see you guys again in future episodes. My name is Carolyn, and this has been the Found Media Podcast.